I gave the manuscript to 3 or 4 writers and readers I respect, a theologian, a couple, authors, and they all said the same thing. They said, Kevin, we know that you um, attempted to write a book on what a holy priest did for your wife and during COVID, but you didn't do that. You wrote a book about the dark night of marriage and what a spouse must do to sort of carry their spouse on their shoulder and climb mountains up and down valleys to make the darn thing work. And he said that they said, that's your book. And I had no idea I had written a book. I didn't know I wrote. I do.
The Dark Night of the Soul is the name of a great work of mystical theology by the 16th century Spanish mystic, St. John of the Cross. Most of us are familiar with the phenomenon, and these difficult occasions where we are awake when we ought to be asleep, but instead fighting spiritual battles, are significant in each of our lives. We remember, as shadows creep upon our souls, that no one makes it through this life without crises that send us to our knees. The danger, however, is that we mistake the darkness for all there is. We go down and never come back up. But by God's grace, we do get up. We get through it, and we remember the message of hope. Even a pinprick of light destroys the night's short-lived victory over the day. As the psalmist says, weeping may tarry for the night, but joy comes with the morning. In this way, the light reveals that God was present in the darkness all along. What the prince of darkness meant for evil, God intended for good. Living with a spouse or loved one struggling with addiction, shame, illness, or hidden pain is a heavy burden to bear. Sadly, we are likely surrounded at all times by people enduring the loneliness of heartbreak for another. Indeed, we may be experiencing some degree of this dark night ourselves right now. All of us. Kevin and Krista Wells lived for years under a dark cloud that descended under their roof each night. Krista was a secret binge drinker, harboring deep wounds from her past. Kevin struggled to make sense of his wife's isolation and substance abuse, even as he felt more alive than ever to the power of Christ in his own life. No one knew this family's pain. No one, that is, until Father Martin Flum came along. A wise and courageous priest, Father Flum's light shone brightest as the world grew dark. As the COVID-19 pandemic arrived, he was determined to continue offering the sacramental therapy that his people needed, Krista and Kevin chief among them. To chronicle the incredible story of healing within Kevin's family, as well as to offer a tribute to a truly holy man in holy orders, Kevin Wells has written a harrowing and hopeful new book called The Hermit, the priest who saved a soul, a marriage, and a family. Sure to speak deeply to the hearts of hurting people everywhere, Kevin's book is a journey through the dark night to the promise of morning light. Kevin Wells is a former Major League Baseball writer, award-winning journalist, and Catholic writer. He is the author of Priest and Beggar, The Heroic Life of the Venerable Aloysius Schwartz, also from Ignatius Press, among other books. Kevin lives in Maryland with his aforementioned wife and their children, and it is my pleasure to speak with him today on the Ignatius Press podcast. Kevin Wells, welcome to the Ignatius Press podcast. How are you?
Andrew, I'm great. Thanks for inviting me in.
Well, it's great to talk to you today, Kevin, because I really enjoyed your book, the book that we're going to discuss today, which is called The Hermit, The Priest Who Saved a Soul, a Marriage, and a Family. Now, this book is a tribute to a very special priest, but it is also very much a story about you, your family, and maybe most of all, your wife, Krista. I wonder if you could tell us about a little bit about Krista's struggle and how it gave rise to your telling this story that you've written in this book.
Sure, Andrew. I guess for starters, what I'll tell you, the viewer, is uh, the book really is sort of a third rail from start to finish, from prologue to afterward. But Krista, my wife, set birth to it. It's a the reader will get into a dark night, and sort of where the story, I guess, begins, is I had almost died in 2009. I had a brain aneurysm and a failed surgery to remove the arteriovenous malformation in the blood that was sort of drowning my brain. Cutting to the chase, something I would say, or the priest and his assistant would say, that was in the neuro ICU room that began to pray over me, I was healed. I would say in a supernatural way, maybe a miraculous way even. But when I returned home, everything changed. And one of the things that really changed in my life was I wanted to sort of rest my heart against Christ's heart in a more profound way. I really wanted to sort of get to know that hound of heaven. I was always a faithful Catholic, I think, and I wasn't caught up in too many crazy things, but I was living too comfortably. And it came to me when I was sort of close to Judgment Day, when I did not think I would survive. I understood that nothing was really working, that I wasn't too comfortable knowing that I was going to face Christ maybe within 15 seconds, a minute. So when I got home, and everything did change, and I began to intensify, I would say, most things in my life. More holy hours, all the traditional Catholic heirlooms, more weekday masses. I joined a prison ministry, more rosary, all of it, more measures of love given to my wife and family. But as this sort of change was taking place in me, and I like to think that the Holy Spirit, I was trying to be docile to the Holy Spirit as I sort of charged into this thing, because I knew God sort of needed to do the work. It scared my wife, Krista. Krista was like me, a Catholic, grew up in the Catholic faith, but maybe not as well formed as I was. I'm from a large Catholic family, a family of priests, and she began to become afraid. She began to fear sort of this changed husband, and it opened up a wound in her. I would call it a mother wound from her childhood, and she began to feel shame. This covering of shame covered her, and I didn't know what it was, and I don't think Krista herself knew really what it was, but everything changed, and she began to binge drink red wine in secret, and that set the course, I guess around 2011, for a very trying challenge in our marriage for, I would say, many years, where I learned to, I guess the hard way, to sort of surrender as much as I could, everything, surrender Krista, the continued struggles, the intensification of what I clearly believe to be Satan's work through alcoholism, through addiction, through shame, and just surrender everything to God and stick by my spouse, and just say, God, I'm going to wait this thing out and do my best here on the sidelines as her husband, and wait for you to bring relief, and that led to what happened in the pages, Andrew, that you read of the book, of finally a holy priest, Father Martin Flum, who is now a consecrated hermit, sort of descending the spiral staircase into Krista's shame and her woundedness, and these things that seemed to me to be monsters, untamed beasts that I couldn't get to, and Father Flum certainly could, and he did most of it, or a lot of the work, right in the heart of COVID-19.
Yeah, and I really want to get into the unique setting of the pandemic in which the story unfolds, because I think stories are in a sense just starting to kind of come out of that time where the Lord was kind of at work in all kinds of ways. And maybe that's a segue to talk about Krista's drinking and her shame and the struggles that she was having, and also the struggles that you were enduring. Because one of the things that struck me, Kevin, when I was reading your book, is just how many people will pick up the book and identify something about their own circumstances, their own marriages, and it may not be a secret drinking problem. It may not be exactly what you're talking about, but this place where sometimes couples can get where they're out of sync with each other spiritually, or something like that. You talk about how, at least the impression that I got was, you go through your normal days, but then it was when the sun went down and you kind of went your separate ways. You wrote, a certain deadening would permeate our home. And you wrote, the brokenhearted routine took hold. I wonder if you could say just a little bit more about kind of what that day-to-day reality was like, and what that's been like for you to talk to other, husbands, wives, other people who sort of live through that kind of unknown pain.
Yeah, Andrew, I'd like to address that, but before I step into that realm, I do want to say something that occurred in the writing of this book. So my wife is now healed, 4 years healed, and she had encouraged me to write a book about what a holy priest did for her and other wounded souls during COVID, and really sort of how a priest behaves, or maybe should have behaved during COVID, and not closing his doors, et cetera, et cetera. And I said, you know what, once I finally was convinced to sort of break open this wild story, and began to write, I had thought, I thought that maybe by around chapter 4 or 5, I could get to Father Flum and the healing and the resurrection of Krista, and talk about the glories of healing and Krista's newfound joy and love for Christ, etc. And I found when I began to write, I got to chapter 4 and chapter 5, and I hadn't gotten the Father Flum. I was nowhere close. And chapter 5 went to chapter 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, and I still hadn't got to Father Flum. I still hadn't gotten to Krista's healing. And I was wondering, as a writer, why is this happening? But I just kept writing and sort of ignored it. And finally, in the later chapters, I got to COVID-19 and Krista's reemergence, and the book was finished. And I finally realized when I was done, I didn't know this, I had no idea, but I gave the manuscript to 3 or 4 writers and readers I respect, a theologian, a couple authors, and they all said the same thing. They said, Kevin, we know that you attempted to write a book on what a holy priest did for your wife and during COVID, but you didn't do that. You wrote a book about the dark night of marriage and what a spouse must do to sort of carry their spouse on their shoulder and climb mountains, up and down valleys, to make the darn thing work. And he said that, they said, that's your book. And I had no idea I had written a book. I didn't know I wrote. I do believe in a way, Andrew, I think the Holy Spirit kind of wrote this book. I wanted to write something, and he said, no, I'm writing it. So I do want your viewer to understand that, that dark night that you mentioned, about the deadening that would happen. I didn't know that I needed to grieve those dead nights, those thousands of dead nights where I didn't know how to behave. I didn't know how to love. I didn't know, I'm an old athlete. I like to think of myself as somewhat muscular or masculine, or just kind of fixing things, but I did not know how to do it. And what I began to sort of unfurl in the pages of the book was the mechanisms or the machinations of what I began to understand through Christ, through the Holy Spirit speaking into my darkness. Kevin, this is how you must behave in the dark night, where there is no consolations, where you are in the heart of a desert and you are sand whipped and there is no water, and you're not getting your marital entitlements. and it's getting worse. It's collapsing. So yeah. I think Andrew, to answer your question, it was sort of this surrender to accepting the mystery of suffering and giving it into it and surrendering it all to God the best that I could.
Yeah, I think that will come through to readers, and I really there's so much in the book that we won't be able to get to. But I just it struck me, Kevin, as a man, just I think a man reading the book, I think women will get a whole lot out of it too. But I think a man reading the book, we tend to think as men like, I can just take charge, I can fix this, I can figure this out, and sometimes we really do just have to surrender, don't we, to the Lord, who alone can really do the work, and that really came through in your testimony.
Yeah, I grew up in a family of contractors. I was a builder for a period of my life, 3-generation contracting business. As I said, I grew up in a family that played sports. 6 brothers, we played year-round sports, and you just went after something, you tackled it, and did your best. But I learned in this one, no, there was no tackling. There was simply yielding. There was simply a handing over to God. And what I had learned was, if I did not couple my prayer, my penances, my emotional and physical mortifications to a supernatural faith, that in the darkness God would be a father to it all and take it away. He would be faithful. So it was a supernatural faith that really sort of mushroomed and I guess grew stronger in me in piecemeal fashion, where the darker I got, the more I had to trust. So yeah, I think men oftentimes, as you said, Andrew, want to dive in, but I realized I needed to go the other direction and sort of submit to him.
Yeah. Let's talk about Father Flum, the priest who's on the cover of the book and mentioned in the title. It sounds to me just like a very special holy man, a rare gem. There's so many great priests, of course, but he seems like kind of a very special specimen, even among very great priests. So I wonder if you could just tell us a little bit about him and your relationship with him.
Well, just starting with him, from the beginning of his seminary days, after Mary called him to the priesthood, he really sort of stepped into the burden of his identity, even from year one of seminary days. And what was that? That was an amputation of all worldly comforts. He understood, if he was going to accept the full burden, the full weight of becoming Jesus Christ, of sort of stepping into the skin of Jesus Christ one day as a priest, he needed to become like Jesus, sort of stretched out on the cross, pouring out love, pouring out his prayer, pouring out his penances for his future souls. And because he had this understanding sort of locked in, he set his face like flint, even in seminary. So when he became a priest, he was explosive. So I'm from a family of priests, and I guess because I've written quite a few books at this point on holy priests, I've gotten to know priests from, I would say, I don't know, I would say 5 or 6 dozen priests from throughout the country, and I know a lot of holy, joy-filled, magnanimous priests. But I will never, ever, I don't believe, meet a priest again in my life like Father Martin Flum. He had turned his life over as a slave, like Louis de Montfort to Mary, and said, I will not take a day off. I will not shed my identity. I will just search out souls, as Vianney did in Ars in the 1820s. Father Flum set his face like flint, and he did those things necessary. For instance, abstaining from all meats, abstaining from alcohol, abstaining from comforts, because he knew that these things would act as accelerants to stepping away, or maybe becoming lazy in his priestly identity. So he did the things that he knew would help him become more like Christ. So he was just a man who took his priesthood on.
Yeah, and I want to talk more about Father Flum, but it occurs to me there are some other priests in the book as well, and I think that that's important to acknowledge that your family was ministered to by other priests also who had pivotal roles to play in Krista's recovery and in your family's healing as well. I wonder if you want to say anything about them. One of them being your late uncle, I believe, who is something of a. It seems like sort of a figure that looms large in your life. I wonder if you'd say something about him and those other priests.
Well, yes, thank you, Andrew. It's Monsignor Thomas Wells. He was my dad's brother. Was a priest in the Washington D.C. Archdiocese for 29 years until he was murdered in his rectory in the year 2000. I was very close to him. I grew up in his shadow. He was one of my best friends. And what I'll say about my uncle, Monsignor Tommy Wells, I used to call him Uncle Tommy, Father Flum, Monsignor John Esseff, a 96-year-old mystic and exorcist, really a soul reader, is, if there's any priests that are watching this podcast, if they read the book, what they'll begin to see is just these three priests, for instance, they sort of, in our fallenness, my fallenness, Krista's fallenness, our woundedness, they really grabbed our face masks and they sort of pulled us towards the reality, and they said hard things to us. Why? To condemn us? No. To shake the sin out of us and lead us to heaven. And all three of them, my uncle, 2 nights before he died, explained the cross to Krista. Monsignor Esseff looked Krista in the eye and said she was arrogant and there was a pus within her when she just thought, I'll drink when I want. Father Flum too. Hey, Krista, I can't work with you anymore because you love the demon inside you more than anything I can do, so it's time for you to go. These three priests, by their candor, by their, I'll say, bold charity, contributed to getting into I'll say it again, sort of taking these staircases down into my wife's shame, blowing it up and kind of walking her back up the ladder to where she could breathe again. So these priests were very loving in their boldness, not only to Krista, but to me as well.
Yeah, something that I was wondering about that isn't as strong in the testimony. The testimony of what the priests did was so powerful in your book. I wonder what was it like for other family members, maybe parishioners, friends? How did they know kind of what was going on, and were they able to help you? No,
Andrew. They didn't know because there was a point where I had to make a decision. Well, I'll just say I made a decision to trust in God. So sort of, as I mentioned earlier, when the supernatural faith was growing in me, I began to believe that, even in the darkest days, and they were dark days, that God would be faithful. God would step into the chocolate mess and heal Krista. And I said, well, what do I do with this thing? Like, what do I do with it? So, I saw counselors. I went to an Al-Anon meeting. There were certain steps that I took, but I said to myself, no, you know what? No one needs to know about Krista's pain until finally one day when my children began to grow older and began to realize something's wrong with mom. That's when I had to sort of abort mission and take more drastic changes.
Yeah, and a lot of that is recounted in the book, and it's very gripping. You recount how Krista has certain ups and downs. She journeys a ways towards healing, and then the pandemic comes, and that's so significant for reasons that you talk about. I mean, there were so many people who were struggling in so many ways, and then the world shuts down, and a whole lot of people who were already kind of teetering on the brink fell right into the pit. I mean, they despair swallowed them up because the world was just such a mess. Now, you write about how your biggest concern as the pandemic begins is your wife is on this sort of therapeutic journey that depends upon the sacramental grace of the church that you have to go and get. And suddenly we're thrown into a world where it's really hard now. The churches are closed. And so what was that like for you just in the early days, that initial feeling of, oh my goodness, what are we going to do now?
I was horrified. I was truly horrified because at that point, Father Flum had grabbed my wife's heart and had shown her that to heal from this demon, this long demon of binge drinking, of alcoholism, of addiction, that she really had to commit herself to weekly confessions, intensive spiritual direction, an hour or two or even three in front of the monstrance, adoring Christ, daily mass. She didn't miss mass any days, and I saw, obviously, wonderfully, I saw the reemergence of Krista's soul, like almost like we were dating again 20 years earlier, and I saw my wife again, and then COVID comes, and right away, the bishop in my diocese said, "Hey, we're gonna close churches because it's my duty as your bishop to protect my flock." And right away I said, "This is wrong. I don't care about Krista's body. I don't care about my body. I care about my soul, and I care about Krista's soul right now. More Krista's soul, obviously, Krista's soul." So I was horrified that church doors were locked. Priests sort of went behind the rectory doors and set up these Zoom masses and Zoom things, and I don't have any words for that time other than I did sense, or no, I'll say this: I did know that Satan would come in very quickly after my wife once again, because she was yanked away from the very thing that was healing with her. And we saw what happened in 2020. I mean, we saw BLM, we saw the riots, we saw Antifa, we saw the cities on fire. Why? I mean, why did this happen? Because I believe because demons came in, because I'll be candid now, Andrew, that the church shut down worldwide. There was a moratorium on the sacramental graces of the church. And when that happens, Satan's going to whistle and he's going to call his little chorus and say, "Hey, man, go after them." Mm-hmm. They're not protected. And that was my feeling with Krista. And thank God for the man named Father Martin Flum that God sent into her life at that time.
Yeah, you describe how Father Flum carefully studied canon law. He carefully tried to work within the boundaries that are set for him by his bishop and that sort of thing. But he was able to continue a sacramental ministry for people who were able to come to his church. And you talk about how you and Krista would drive quite a distance, I think, every day to go to mass. What was that experience like?
It was the greatest experience of my life. We were on our honeymoon on those drives because we knew. Well, I knew, and Krista knew as well, and it was right away. There was no delay in the there was no delay in what Father Flum did for souls at the very point, at the very tip of the spear of COVID-19 shutting down churches. Father Flum sort of found a way to open his up. So those drives were what can I tell you? They were it was like driving to I'm an old baseball writer, right? So I played baseball. It was like driving to Game 7 of the World Series. And knowing when I got there of the exhilaration of opening the church door when worldwide other church doors were closed, they were locked, you couldn't get in. And now, obviously, in a spiritual way, I knew Krista was going to receive the Eucharist. I knew that she was going to get the rocket fuel to keep the demons away. I knew that we could pray afterwards and adore the Blessed Sacrament. I knew that Father Flum that day before Mass was going to lead us in the Rosary, so Krista could be maternally protected. I mean, it was bar at St. Michael's in Baden, Maryland, where Jesus was fully alive, even at the very beginning of COVID-19.
You know, I was thinking about, when I was reading your account, I was thinking about of all things, the scene in C.S. Lewis's book, The Silver Chair, where Jill Pole comes up to this stream and she faces Aslan, and she says, "You know, can you step away so I can cross the stream?" And he says no, you know, he basically declares that he's not safe. You know, that sort of that life with Christ has a certain kind of, there's something about it that requires that we take a risk. And, you know, I'm really hoping that we're going to hear more of the kinds of stories that you're telling, but I just really appreciated, you know, we live in a world that has this kind of slogan of safety first, but as a matter of fact, that's really not the best way to live. Even while we want to respect certainly certain prerogatives of people, but what you describe in your book is I think a real testimony to striving for the kingdom, striving for the things that are the most important. Did that occur to you kind of as you were writing it, that you might be providing kind of a larger context for other people's, kind of COVID experience?
Well, as I mentioned, I didn't know what I was writing.
Yeah.
I thought I was writing about a holy priest, but yeah, looking back, I realized that I needed to mourn. Those chapters was really my first mourning, I'll say, of those tough years. But yeah, I don't think any of us escapes the fact that dark mountains must be traveled. These valleys must be canvassed to get to heaven. I mean, you don't sort of slow walk getting to heaven. The perilous journeys must be. You must step into things you don't want to step into. What's the old expression? You got to step into the fire to find out who you are. And it's you got to step into the groan. I'll say you step into the groan and say, Lord, you know what? I'm hanging on to you now. I just ask that you hang on to me. It's all I got. Again, it goes back to supernatural faith. But yeah, there's a lot of ugly days in the midst of that faith.
Yeah. Now, where is Krista at this part of the journey? She's had some ups and downs. She's even gone to get some treatment at a facility somewhere far away from your home. She's dependent upon the church and the sacraments of the church. When does this like really serious healing, like what does that start to look like?
Well, I guess you could say it happened in piecemeal fashion. Father Flum understood that without getting into the wound of shame and extracting it, like Father Flum, I would call him sort of a connoisseur of wounds. He knew where he needed to get to, and it wasn't like a wound from 5 years ago or 6. It was a wound from the childhood. Again, it was maybe a mother wound, and once he could get to it and sort of hold it up for Krista to see and say, "Hey, Krista, it's time for you to put the sign down, put the billboard down. You are not unworthy. You are not seen as a burden. You're not unworthy of love. Put the stinking sign down." And once Krista finally began to see that the sign was a lie, it was the tool of Satan. Well, Father Flum then knew in the void of her putting the sign down, she could be sacramentalized. He could more easily spiritually direct her. Absolution in the confessional box would actually feel like her soul was being cleansed, et cetera, et cetera. Her time in front of the monstrance would actually feel like Jesus was stretching into her. So I don't know, Andrew, if I'm answering the question, but during that time how do I say this? During that time of her beginning to sort of come out of the tomb, like the lid of the tomb was sort of slowly being opened. Satan, as we all know, Satan's wily. The demon's wily, and every now and then he's going to snap her back into the coffin. Why? Because every now and then that old demon from the past, a lie from the past, will sort of pulled Krista back, and maybe she would drink that night. It was infrequent, but she would get snapped back into the tomb. So Father Flum, I would say, myself, just through sticking by her, just said, no, we're going to be patient because it's going to take a little while. But we both saw that she was making enormous progress by really the light in her eyes.
Was Father Flum helpful to you in counseling you when you had to kind of endure patiently, maybe when Krista had a relapse or you kind of had a bump in the road?
He was my umbilical cord to sanity. Yeah, he was a lifeline for me, because he had known so well of the woundedness of Krista's. And he said, "Hey, Kevin, the best thing you can do right now, the best thing you can do is practice patience. And if there is a night, and when there is a night when Krista falls and she wakes up the next day and she's feeling that the weight of shame, and she knows you're disappointed, and she knows she let you down and let God down, look her in the eye and say, honey, I love you. Let's get back on this train. Let's keep going northbound. We're going to get this thing right." Father Flum would just say, Kevin, stay in that place Do not let the emotions gain hold of you. Stay in that place and keep your eyes on her. She might be in the ocean, and the ocean might be sort of choppy, and maybe it's a mess in there, and maybe she's clinging to shipwreck right now. But don't you take your eyes off of her, because she is getting it right. You be patient.
Yeah, and that comes through in the book that there must have been a long period of time where it took time to even get to the place where Krista was willing to kind of, in a sense, like submit to the healing that she could receive. And I'm sure that even after that point, when you had the relapses or the ups and downs, there could be some real pain. But it seems to me, looking back on retrospect, that was such a huge win, was getting to the place where she wasn't denying it anymore. She wasn't trying to, rationalize it or anything like that, but was really willing to submit to the healing that the Lord can give.
Yeah. Any of your viewers who have spouses or have loved ones in their lives who suffer from addiction, they'll know how dark it is when your loved one is under that spell, let's say, and it was a long time. And I'll remind your viewer that Krista wanted to expose herself in those dark times, so Father Flum could be exposed, the holiness, the holy priesthood of Father Flum. So yeah, number one, just getting through those years of dryness, of darkness, of just, is there any hope anymore? Because it's accelerating. The binge drink is accelerating. She acts like she hates me when I try and converse with her about what's going on. She cries herself to sleep at night, and I can't touch her because I'm the enemy. So I had to, when I finally surrendered, that I couldn't really enter into that realm, that she was sort of in a different countryside, speaking a different language, or I was speaking a different language. When I surrendered her to God and just said, God, she's yours now, and I'll wait on the sidelines. And Father Flum stepped in. That confluence of faith in God and Father Flum stepping in, I knew that he was really an answered prayer. So I just kind of waited it out for it to take full effect.
Yeah. I love too how Father Flum has such an enormous influence and is so instrumental in Krista's healing. But that ultimately, you tell a beautiful story of Krista having a kind of encounter with Our Lady that seems to be kind of the exclamation point on the story of her healing. It's not you, it's not even Father Flum. It's Our Lady herself who comes to Krista. I don't want to give it all away because it's so beautifully written, but I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that, about Mary's role in this.
I will, without telling what happened. And Andrew, you're right. This was the culminating moment that finally snapped the neck of the devil, and Krista broke free from drinking. And but what I won't tell the story because I'd like your readers to or your viewers to actually read the Hermit. But I will say this: there was a time for a couple of years where Krista was making at least one daily holy hour a day, and she had shared with Father Flum, "Hey, Father, I always find myself kneeling in the front of the statue of Mary." It was her favorite statue of Mary. It was a beautiful image of Mary in her bathed in her humility, and I can't seem to take Jesus into my heart. I want to. I'm desirous of letting him sort of, be my father, but I can't do it. And Father Flum said, "Well, Krista, I tell you what. Why don't you just keep praying to Mary and ask her to maternally bring you to her son? Just stay there a while at adoration, and just stay with Mary, and one day it'll happen." So that's what Krista did for many, many months, if not a year and a half. And then one day, in what I'll say to be supernatural fashion, very dramatic fashion, Mary put an exclamation point on bringing Krista to her son. And that was the night, in the middle of the night, that everything changed.
Yeah. It struck me just as you were talking now about something that you talk about a little earlier in the book, where you describe how you put a statue of Our Lady in your backyard of your home. And it just struck me that maybe that's kind of symbolic of part of this journey too, that she's back there looking in all along as well in all those dark nights.
Yes, when we moved to this home we live in now, Krista was already in the throes of the binge drinking, and the first thing I did, really, when we moved in, is I built a grotto in the backyard. Again, I'm from a family of masons, not the bad masons, the other kind of masons, and at least I don't think so. But I have an affinity. I have a love for Mary as she presented herself in Lourdes to Bernadette. So it's sort of a replica. I wouldn't say a replica, but it's kind of similar to the Lourdes Grotto and Mary. So those nights, every night, as I described in the book, I had bathed this grotto in light. So at 2 a.m, 3 a.m, if I woke up, I could just look out the window and see Mary facing me, and that was purposeful. Like, I purposely put the grotto where it was sort of facing my bedroom, and she was this nightlight, nightlight into my soul, almost like I was a little kid who was afraid of monsters, and I had this nightlight by my bedside. But she was the nightlight that was always speaking to me, that say, "Hey, Kevin, I was there too. I was at Golgotha, and I was in the mud, genuflecting to my son's slaughtering, and I know you're in the dark night as well in a different way. But as I didn't leave my son, you can't leave Krista, and I'm always going to be here for you to mother not only Krista, but I'm here to mother you, because I know you're going through this too. So just keep coming to me." And that's what I did. That's what I did so often, not only with my little gazes at 3 a.m. At Mary in my grotto, but also with these rosary walks that I took on the bike path. And Mary, I guess I'm lucky. I grew up in a family that my parents led all their siblings in the rosary when we were little kids. So I grew up with really a sincere love in my heart for Mary. So Mary at that time was how do I say it? She was very special to my heart.
Yeah, well, that sure comes through in the book. Father Flum, now he plays this pivotal role. He's this important figure not only in your life and Krista's life, but serves this incredible function during these dark times, offering mass and keeping his church open and everything. But he makes this decision. We're not giving anything away because you tell us at the beginning of the book. In fact, the book is called The Hermit, so we know that he's going to kind of go off and do something else. But in your understanding, what was that decision for him? What was that like for him? Why did he do that, to decide that it was time for him to remove himself after he had distinguished himself in a way with being so present, to people?
I think it was two things. The first is, he once told me that even way back in seminary, he felt this inner urge to always want to pray. And he wondered back then, he said, why, is this normal? Don't all seminarians feel the way I do? But then he began to understand, when he began to make his daily holy hours in seminary, and there was no adoration in his seminary. He had to leave and drive to a parish across town to make his daily holy hour. He began to understand, no, maybe this desire for prayer is different. It's just different. But I'm just going to oblige it. And as his priesthood began to grow, he became an associate, and then he became a pastor. This desire to sort of fall away into prayer mostly in front of the monstrance, it was increasing. And when COVID-19 came like a hatchet upon the world, and the church candidly responded, I'll speak for myself, not Father Flum, I think negligently to souls at that time. And I don't know if there still has been a reckoning for how the church handled itself during that time, in sort of, it seemed to me anyway, of subservience to unnamed medical panels and Anthony Fauci and politicians. But Father Flum, I would believe, and I can't crawl into his mind, but I believe during that time, he said, man, oh man, the church has travailed now, and clergy is could use some help. The world in 2020 changed. Everything changed, especially after that awful summer, that awful year. So I think it was at that point where, in his own mind and his own soul, he said, I I'd like to offer the remainder of my life as a holocaust, as an expiation to God, to beg for a renewal in the priesthood, to beg for a healing to the church. And so he sought his bishop, and he asked for permission. So there is such a it's rare, but there is such a vocation as a consecrated hermit. And for a few years, in order, well, I won't give away too many deals, had requested that he become a hermit on their property, and his bishop consented and said, yeah, if you believe in this form, this radical form of life, of prayer, then it's yours. So that's where he's been for 3 years. His entire life has become a prayer, a his entire life is prayer, mortifications, and penances, and an offering to God, as sort of, hey God, I offer myself that you can help the world now.
And you say in the book that you'll never see him again, but do you still feel that his ministry is having an effect on you and your family?
Without question, because he promised a few nights before he took off forever and left our lives to become a hermit. He was in our backyard. We had Krista served him her famous shrimp bradiavolo, and Mary was illuminated, sort of looking at the three of us from the grotto, and he said, I'll keep you two in prayer. I'll keep you two in steady prayer. And Father Flum wasn't one to lie. So the fact that he's praying for us, as he's praying for the world, it's not just Andrew, he's praying for you in a certain way, the universal church, for its healing, etc. Yeah, without question. And especially, and the reason I most know this, I would say, Andrew, is because the light in Krista's eyes. Our marriage has never been better. I'll say this not as a silly cliche, but we're kind of riding this honeymoon of problematic times, and so yeah, I would say that Father Flum's prayers are still efficacious in Krista in my life.
Well, you've sort of already answered, but I'll ask anyway. The last question that I wanted to ask, the image of, I don't know why, I just got kind of fixated on this image of the loneliness in your home during those nights. And my last question for you is just, what's it like at your house after the sun goes down now?
Yeah, man, that was some, Andrew, those chapters were tough. I mean, those were raw and tough chapters. And I was, by the way, real quick, I was scared to death to show those chapters to Krista when I was done. I didn't know how she would receive them. But I gave them to her. There was a lot of crying, by both of us, but she's like, yeah, this was as it was. So how is it now when the sun goes down? Oh man, it's the greatest thing in the world. We see the pink clouds. We see the purple clouds. We hear the bird song. We feel the breeze in the air. I mean, and life has changed. Nothing's the same anymore. So when the sun goes down and the moon rises, it's great. And you know what? It's great, Andrew. When that happens, that's the time where Krista and I usually go into our little our favorite little room in the house, our living room, and we pray the rosary together. So that's how we baptize the evenings nowadays.
Wow, an incredible story of healing, redemption. There's really something for most people, I think, who are struggling with all kinds of things. I think they'll get so much out of the book. The book is called The Hermit, A Priest Who Saved a Soul, a Marriage, and a Family, now available from Ignatius Press. The author is Kevin Wells. Kevin, thank you so much for taking the time to join me today.
Thank you, Andrew.